Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Popular culture part 7. Are we on 7? Wow. TV. So the belly of the beast itself. So as I mentioned at the beginning of the series, television represents the most popular, watching television represents the most popular pastime by far in the United States, Europe, and many countries in the world. And it represents for many people something like 80% or more of their free time is spent watching television. Of course, how you define free time, soft figure, but it eats up a tremendous amount of time. And for all that, most of the discussions that you encounter on television discuss the content of television, which is interesting and certainly worth talking about. I would like to talk about the form and impact of the technology and the way it's presented within the context of popular culture, because I think it's often overlooked and is hugely important because of the nature of the medium itself and how it impacts us. And so this will be sort of unpeeling an onion. There are layers upon layers to how this works. And I meant last time to give you homework, which I failed to do, so I apologize for that. So I'm going to give you a little assignment now, and if you have time or in a place where it works, I hope you can pause this lecture and then run the experiment and then come back. But if not, that's fine. We'll just pretend like you have and we'll go forward. And then when you have an opportunity, I do suggest running it because I think it's highly illustrative of some of the aspects that we're about to explore. And the assignment is quite simple. It's get whatever you watch TV on. Could be a lot of people watch their computer screens or actual TV if you have one, and set it up, get in your chair, your comfy place, however you usually are when you watch TV. And don't turn the TV on. Just sit there and watch it for 5 minutes. I call this Zen and the art of TV viewing. And as you're doing that, sort of think about how you feel. You actually don't need to think too much about it because you're not thinking on the TV screen, so you will definitely do this. So just don't have the TV on, don't have the computer on. Just sit for 5 minutes the way you would watch TV as if there was something on, and then see kind of what happens. So take a quick break, 5-minute break. Stare at a blank screen for 5 minutes because what could be more educational than that, I guess, and then come right back. Okay. Hopefully you took a chance if you could. If not, run this experiment in the future because I think it's great. I used to do this in class and it was painful. I'd wheel in a big TV and we would sit there and the students be like, all right, they get excited because they're all ready to watch some TV. And I go, all right, we're going to watch 5 minutes of TV. And I would just have it not come on and they would, moan and groan at me and laugh and all that. And then we would sit quietly and just stare at the screen. And let me tell you, that 5 minutes seemed like an eternity. Oh my God, it did. It seemed like a long time. So, but what is this supposed to illustrate? Now, if you're like my students, and of course I'd have them record this, and like myself, a bunch of things happen. And this is what's important about understanding the nature of TV as a technology, not about the content of TV, but the form itself, how the technology works. And what you have is flashing images. This is the core of television. You have sound too, which is of course important as well, but it's really the flashing images. And those moving images, particularly in color, but black and white worked as well, cause, there's different names for it in psychology, like an orientation response or something. It's flashing images attract our attention. And visual stimuli take a lot of processing power. And so what happens with your brain when you're getting a lot of stimulus, in this case, it would be visual stimuli primarily, although audio as well, mostly visual, is it starts to turn off other kinds of receptors, other kinds of information that it can process to free up parts of the brain so that it can focus more on processing the visual imagery that's coming in. And so this has a whole series of physiological impacts. So it turns off most of your proprioceptors, not all of them, but a bunch of them. And your proprioceptors are those senses that you have that allow you to sense yourself, your body, where you are in space, all these sorts of things. And so a bunch of things happen. One, you tend not to know whether or not you're hungry. Your ability to taste goes way down. Your sense of time as we just experienced, gets basically turned off. So you lose your sense of time. Your sense of place tends to get highly restricted. So where you are in three-dimensional space gets restricted. You kind of lose track of where your body is. You may have felt this, like if your leg goes to sleep, or all of a sudden you realize that your arm's in a weird angle, or you get a neck ache because you realize you were sitting in a weird position while watching TV. It's ever happened. It's because the sensors, the motor sensors of your body that would normally say, hey, move about a bit, are turned way down, turned very low. Your hearing is less good. It's less good than it would be. You're still hearing, of course, but it's not very refined hearing. And you certainly don't tend to hear anything from your ambient environment. Not because the TV is too loud, although that often is the case. People tend to listen very loud. But because your mind is also focused on the sounds associated with the visual input, and so it tends to ignore other sounds. Your mind is just filtering out, saying that sound did not come from the visual thing that I'm focused on, so it does not matter. I'm oriented on the visual input. And so what happens when you add this all up is you get the inverse effect when you do the Zen and the Art of TV Watching experiment, where time seems to drag. You're hyper aware of time. You hear everything. You feel your stomach gurgle. You start to fidget. You go, oh, my foot is sore. Oh, I've got an itch on my back. You start paying attention to what the other students are doing. You start thinking about all kinds of things. Your mind becomes active. You start imagining things. You start worrying about things. You start remembering things. You start thinking about what you're going to do next. Again, the visual stimulus overwhelms your capacity to think clearly. And so what you're doing with the Zen and the Art of TV Watching is you're just getting a catalog of the impact of the medium itself. All the things that you experience and seem weird and odd, and obviously this is not happening, but all those senses get turned off or turned way down. And so the medium itself really is transportative. It's almost like a drug, or maybe it is just like a drug. It has these very powerful physiological impacts that have nothing to do with content, or very little to do with content, and a whole lot to do with simply the fact that you're getting flashing visual images continuously, and it causes this very strong physiological response that generates all of these sorts of knock-on effects. And so watching TV itself creates a physiological state of existence. Of course, this is on average, affects different people in different ways to a certain extent, but in general, and I'm sure we've all had this, felt this, where you watch, if you're watching a movie or watching TV, all of a sudden it's over, or 3 hours have gone by, or something like this happens, and you're like, oh my gosh, I didn't even realize that time, where did time go? What happened? Or you realize either, oh wow, I'm really hungry because I didn't eat, or if you snack while you're watching TV, people tend to eat a lot more because they're not getting the feedback that they're full, because again, those receptors are turned down. Also, you're not very clear on what the food you're eating tastes like, because again, hypervisual stimulation tends to overwhelm senses like smell and taste. And so it puts you in this very odd state. Now, there's not a criticism of the state, it's just sort of, this is what happens physiologically when you're doing it. But it is important to think about when we talk about some of the other effects and associations with TV. So in America, on average, TV viewing hours are very rough to calculate. Plus, particularly, it's become even more difficult because people are streaming now and getting a lot of the media from YouTube or TikTok or other social media oriented shifts. But still, the calculations say in America we're looking at something like 28 hours a week of immersion in this sort of medium, whether it's from streaming or it's from YouTube or it's from a traditional TV, cable, or satellite television. It doesn't really matter so much. I mean, there are interesting variations there, but generally as the medium itself. And so basically you have millions, hundreds of millions, billions of people who are spending extended periods of time in this sort of very strange suspended state. And that is one element to always think about when we talk about the medium of TV, because it does influence how you can experience and think about the world. Because one, it overwhelms your mind. It makes it very difficult to think because you're getting all this stimulus. And so you either have to ignore the stimulus, which is, of course, a challenge, or you have to get your thoughts overwhelmed. There's one analogy I like that people say that if you ever see a movie or a TV show based on a book that you like, the image that you get from the movie tends to overwhelm whatever images you had created in your mind. You can't, if you like the Lord of the Rings series, probably the images that stick with you if you've seen the movies when you read the book are the images not that you had in your mind originally, but the images that the movie put in your mind, because that stimulation is so strong, it tends to overwhelm your own imaginative faculties, and then there they are. This is why when I talked about Disney wanting to be in your dreams, right? It wants to shape the visions in your mind to the point of your subconscious so that the visions in your mind when you dream are shaped by these external media. And they're very powerful at this. So one, just the form itself is important. Two, if we look not so much at content, but the way most TV shows are made. And I'm just having to generalize here because I know there's exceptions in many ways, but on average, just one small aspect of it, and this is the jump cut. So what a jump cut is when the camera shifts without pause. Basically, it's like if characters are talking, you have the face of one character who says hello, then you jump to the other character's face who says hello, and then it jumps back and says, how are you doing? It jumps back, says, oh, I'm doing great. Whatever that is, 3 or 4 jump cuts. This is a completely benign seeming element of the medium. It's just a technique that is used for pacing. It can create tension. It can be used in any number of ways. But if you watch the average TV show, again, this is an experiment you can run. Take a TV show that you like, one that you enjoy watching, and just instead of watching the show itself, see how many jump cuts there are. See how often the show goes clip, 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 clip. And usually, and this varies, sometimes there's no blank scenes, blank frames, although that's sort of outdated in the digital world between a jump cut, but often there's 1 to 3 to 4 frames, will be a tenth of a second or so of black, so that it's seen black. You really can't see the black, but it's there. It's just a moment of pure black, and then back to the other face. And this creates an almost stroboscopic effect, or not almost, it's probably very much like a stroboscopic effect, but it's going on 1 second or 2 seconds or 5 seconds. But just take maybe 1 5-minute segment of a show that you like and count how many times there's a jump cut. Like how often does this happen? And what happens is these sorts of formal elements, the way the production is made, not necessarily what's in the production, but the way it's made, has this dramatic impact on how we perceive the world and how we experience these things. Because one, the camera angle controls what you see. So it's a very tight medium in that sense. So it's telling you what you can look at in any given time. Because your field of vision is huge. The field of vision of the TV camera is very small. And so if you look forward and you just look very close, like put your hands up beside your eyes so that you can't see hardly at all, just the width of a TV screen, and then blink your eyes, once every second, you have this very narrow framed vision of the world. Again, there's nothing wrong with this. But what happens is we find things that don't have jump cuts now, on average, boring. So over the last 30, 40 years of TV production, the number of jump cuts has tended to increase until now, some shows, they just have so many you can't even hardly believe it. But what happens is the content itself might be quite boring and anodyne and is just unwatchable, essentially. But the cuts themselves are what they use to make it interesting. We feel that somehow it stimulates us, and so we go, oh, this is stimulating, not because of content, which, maybe it's okay, maybe it's great, maybe it's terrible. But just because of this, I was at the airport one time and there was some show. I didn't even know what the show was, and I wish I knew, but I don't. But it was, they kept going back from like a police station to a headquarters of like a government headquarters. And every time they did, they would do like 4 or 5 quick jump cuts, traffic, headquarters door, people, and then they do a shaky cam, and then they would do a cut back to the other one. And they did, I don't know why they shaky cam, they did it, but they kept doing this interleaving of these scene settings. And because it was jump, it's sort of like, okay, something's happening. But nothing was happening. It was really just like a parking lot building door. But it made it watchable in a way. Terrible, but sort of, it kind of caught your attention somehow. And so this continually being immersed in a world that flashes kind of tends to make a sense of the world as normally experienced kind of weird. About 20 years ago, I think it was The Gap. I'm 95% sure it was The Gap. Now I think about it, I'm 100% sure it was The Gap. Started redoing the lighting in their stores so that people felt like that was the lighting that was on TV, which is of course very strange and artificial and has nothing to do with natural light. But they realized that people wanted to look like how they perceived people on TV. And so in their dressing rooms and try-on spaces and their stores generally, they put in this really weird bright white light, which people kind of noticed. But this was the idea. I don't know if that worked out to be a very good idea, but that's how influential this is. Like, let's start remaking the real world, quote unquote, there, air quotes around real, so that it looks more like the TV world, because people identify more with the TV world than they do with the quote unquote real world. So even at just the technology and form level, it's having all of these powerful influences on us, and we don't think about this. And what happens is this creates a sort of effective censorship, because there's things that just can't be shown on TV. It's not censorship of government, although that exists too, of course, but it's censorship of form. For instance, things I like to go on long walks, particularly long walks on the beach or long walks in the forest. Now, this would be incredible. You just can't do it on TV, right? I mean, I guess probably someplace on YouTube people do this, but I've seen videos on YouTube, this is a perfect example, where people hike the Pacific Crest Trail, but they do like 4 seconds a day. And so what you get is flash, 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 for how many days it takes them to hike the Pacific Crest Trail. And they go, oh, cool. And I was like, there it is, right? The Pacific Crest Trail isn't cool unless it's flashy, which is, of course, roughly speaking, the antithesis of what it's theoretically supposed to be like to hike the Pacific Crest Trail, which is a very long trail, by the way, that goes from Mexico to Canada across the west coast of the United States. So, and it takes, I don't know, a while to hike. I mean, a couple months at least. So like even that, which should be this very slow, meditative, but it just doesn't work. And it doesn't work because you don't get smell. Again, don't get the smell sense. Can't have it through the TV. Can't feel the breeze or the wind or the sun on you. Your vision is incredibly narrowed. You cannot see wide. So if you can run a test on yourself, again, I love all these tests. If you put your fingers, put your arms out straight and put your fingers up, index fingers up, and then look how wide you can look straight ahead and see how wide you can put your arms out and still see your fingers. It's usually right around 160 to 180 degrees, about 160 degrees. So almost a straight line, you can see that wide. It's blurry on the edges. Only a very small frame is really, truly in focus, but you can kind of get blurry image to increasingly clear. You have good depth of focus. By the way, we have incredible color and shading that TV just can't reproduce. And so you take an environment that's filled with wind and air and smells and the feel of the sun and the feel of the sand, and the seagulls are flying off in the distance, and you can see maybe 5 miles out across the water. And none of that's available. You don't have access to that. And so something that people tend to like is not presentable in the medium. It's it's censored by the medium, which is not a bad thing. It's just to say this is what happens. And we tend not to think that all these elements are just not present. So it can do a very narrow range of things. And so it has this influence on how we perceive what's valuable in the world, because if you spend 80% of your free time in an environment where walking on the beach just isn't a thing, basically. I mean, you can show lovers hand in hand for 5 seconds. That's fine, right? We all know that shot. But it's got to be quick, and we got to have a lot of camera angle shifts, and we got to have a lot of jumping around again. Otherwise, it's really boring. And so things that people actually like to do repeatedly presented as incredibly boring, if it's because the medium can't communicate it, can't communicate the beauty and power and loveliness of certain things. And so, again, the formal elements, the formal structures influence how we perceive the world beyond anything else. Now, if we start looking at content a little more, wow, it gets even more interesting. Again, onions upon onions upon onions here. And so you go, right. So here's a form that doesn't do some things very well, which is fine. All mediums are restricted. But you add in this element in the United States, the estimates are, and again, this is going to be a loose estimate, how reliable, but it's going to be in this range, is the average American who watches TV will see about 20,000 commercials a year. So that's a lot of commercials to be inundated with. It's about 20,000. And think about that. It's an amazing number. And so who cares what the content of those commercials is? What the content is of those commercials, it's still this relentless barrage of you need, you want, you must, and that psychological just repetition. It works, and it works because of what we just talked about. It's being shown on a medium that disables or reduces your capacity for critical thought and reflection, because the visual stimulus just makes it harder to think. And those ideas and those images, more important than the content, get in your mind. Like I said, when the movie characters overwhelm your imagination for the characters you read about in a book, it's not because you want it to, it's because it overwhelms your imagination, your own capacities. Same thing, if you're seeing 20,000 commercials a year, less in Europe, by the way, because they allow fewer commercials per hour, and they don't allow as many commercials in those time slots. So it's a different structure, but it's still plenty, still more than probably is good for people, as it were. So this massive amount of advertising is tied to a medium, which kind of disables your capacity to think rationally. It's a beautiful setup when you think about it. I mean, they're made for each other. Marketing and a disabling medium that people ingest in massive quantities. And so this has this incredible impact that is, you see it everywhere, but we almost have a hard time tracking it down simply because it's so ubiquitous. This is the problem. Its ubiquity makes it difficult to understand that it's constantly present. Now, the nature of this. And so you have the 20,000 commercials. Well, the commercials are there because even with the streaming services now, which tend to be running away from subscription and towards commercial services because they found out there's more money there, not surprisingly, that they're this, again, the relentlessness of it, but it means that the people who pay the commercials pay for the show. And so people who are trying to sell you things need you to be in a particular frame of mind, or more than one frame of mind. But first, we need your attention. Second, we need you not to change the channel. So whatever show we're showing, we need you and almost everybody else that we can get to not change the channel. And so how do we do that? And here's where you get to this place of not actual censorship, but censorship by economic form. So you have censorship, not censorship is the wrong word, you have the limitations of the medium, the way it impacts you and what it can and can't present, which narrows the world dramatically and how you influenced you. And then the economic structure of television, by and large, and I'll talk about the cable and streaming service exception in a second, has this drive in it that says, I need to make this as easy to access to as many people as possible. That's the deal. Because if I make it difficult in any way, I lose viewers. I have to make it as broadly acceptable as possible. And what this does functionally is it creates this incredible limit on what can and cannot be presented on television, particularly when you're aiming not even for a general broad audience, but for that 18 to whatever 35 or 40-year-old demographic that is the most valuable. That is the one that all the advertisers want. They tend to pay a fine premium up to double what they do for other audience types. Not that they do advertise other audience types as well, but that's your core demographic. And so certain things just become impossible. For instance, anything that's truly controversial, it's okay to have sort of faux things that people get upset about and all that, but anything that would really challenge your value structure or make you think about the world differently in a profound way over a length of time, one, it's difficult to present because your thinking is challenged, but two, it would really upset some people. So some people might like it, but a lot of people are going to be upset. And so advertisers are like, hey, we don't want to be associated with shows that cause the values of our viewers to come into question. So one thing that essentially never happens in American TV, you can find some rare exceptions on deep cable channels, but I'm talking about the core shows that make up 80 or 90% of the viewing time, for instance, is an actual discussion of religion, either as a topic of a show or as a, what would you call it, as a sit around and chat, right? So you can have all of these shows that have, cheating husbands and children from multiple wives and all this that present faux controversy. But these faux controversies that get the audience all excited, the viewers all know that those are bad people, right? We're all on the side of judging them as bad. That's all fine. There's no problem with that. Because we know that our values are not being challenged. In fact, our values are being reinforced because, something like a Dr. Phil or one of these kinds of ridiculous shows, they sit there and they make you feel good about you because they're like, oh yeah, at the end of the day, we all know what's right and wrong and, blah, 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 blah. And so this continual need to have our fundamental sense of the world reinforced so that you can't have narratives or moments that create too much challenge. I guess one of the first shows on TV, I think what was it called? Will and Grace, where they had gay characters who were central to the plot, gay male characters that were central to the plot. And apparently one of the rules was no men kissing, right? You can't have men kissing. You have, heterosexual kissing, totally fine. Men kissing, no. So here's a show in which you have gay men who are dating all the time, but we're just not supposed to show a lot of a physical affection, all that. So the idea is okay, roughly speaking, as long as no one has to see any physicality. So, right, because that's going to just upset people too much. And again, religion, anything that really, I'm trying to think of some other things. There's so many, it's just hard to articulate. Generally, you can't have evil win. I mean, this sounds like a crazy old-fashioned, it used to actually be a rule in the film censorship that came into place in the 30s. Used to have a rule that said evil could not triumph or could not be victorious. But it's more or less the situation still that 90%, 99% of the time, the quote-unquote good guys, who we know who they are, will triumph. And it just goes on and on because I have to make something that's simple, accessible, not too upsetting, that doesn't challenge you, that doesn't address any of our core beliefs or feelings about the world, and doesn't certainly upset them and try to change them or really explore them in any deep and meaningful way. Because while some people might find that interesting, a lot of people are going to just be wildly upset by it. And of course, viewing would tank. And so forget that. So the censorship is not from some government rules, although we do have those, and many of them are quite silly. The United States, for those of you who don't know, we're really, really sensitive about nudity, but you can just shoot people in the head 24 hours a day. It seems like a strange take on this, but hey, that's the U.S. That's how we do it. And so while you have not a lot of government censorship, you do have a lot of self-censorship by the networks, and mostly because it's the advertisers not wanting to be associated with anything that will upset their audience. And so you end up with this massive amount of content being produced in any number of mediums, in any number of different formats. However, the basic value, philosophical, intellectual structure is very uniform and consistent. Because if it wasn't, it would be challenging and confusing, and then you would lose viewership, and then you wouldn't have advertisers, and the whole system would fall apart. Now, where you see this break down in this model is in the subscription services, because the subscription services have a very different sort of protocol. And this protocol is, I need to make shows that are sufficiently good that you will pay a subscription fee. And it turns out that for most of these, if I have some content that you kind of like, but I can produce, a show a week that you really want to watch, you will keep your subscription going. So I don't need to make one show that appeals to everybody. I need to make 20 shows that appeal to 5% of my audience a lot. And so that's why, the HBOs and the Netflix and Amazon Prime have been experimenting and spending unbelievable amounts of money trying to produce this kind of content. And people have noticed it. Some people say, it's a golden age of TV and all this, because all this experimentation has been going on, because that's such a different driver. And it freed writers and producers and directors to do really quite different kinds of stories, to do different kinds of presentations, to do, different kinds of storylines. And it will be interesting to see as the streaming services start shifting towards where you can pay less to get ads, if this does in fact slowly erode some of that creativity and experimentation that people who enjoy this seem to have been appreciating quite a bit. And so that sort of transition of art form was possible because the actual dynamic changed. By the way, this is why television in Europe tends to be different, and also film in Europe, because there's so much more support and money that comes from either cable fees or from government investments in film that says, we don't want you to get the biggest audience, we want you to produce something interesting and great that wins award. Audience good too, but we'd also like to win some awards. And so, you get this crazy mix of terrible and good and interesting and just all over the map. It tends to be a much broader spectrum of possible forms that are presented. And so what happens when people complain back to the mainstream of TV is people go, this is people, educated, intellectual people who like to criticize TV tend to say, there's just not the kind of quality on there that we would like to see, and blah, blah. And it's like, well, in a way, it's necessarily true, because the audience would be too small, and it would be too upset. It would upset too many people, and they would get complaints, and people would change the channel, and this would be not good. So in the United States, you can have religion. You can have, for instance, lots of religious shows. That's not a problem. You can have shows that never mention religion because, hey, don't touch that rail. But to have a show that explored, Good Omens was just, Good Omens 2, I guess, was based on a Terry Pratchett project with, I think, Neil Gaiman. I think that's correct. And they did do this. And I did not see the show, but I did read a review of it. And the reviewer said there was all these tangential segments where they just talked about a bunch of religious stuff. And I thought that was hilarious, because the whole point of the project was to mock Christianity, right? Like, this was a show designed to sort of make fun of all the tropes and content of Christianity. And, it's interesting, but rare. But I thought, wow, that's a good idea. Good idea for someone to roll that out, because you just don't get that very much. So these sorts of elements that we tend not to think about too much have vastly more influence and impact on the way we perceive the most popular of popular cultural mediums, which is television and the associated streaming, etc. And it's just unbelievably both narrow and homogeneous in its presentation because of these incredibly powerful elements that shape the structure in which we experience television and the content of it. And one reason I tend to almost never watch television is because I kind of find all of this very irritating. I don't know. It's not a form I like. And I'll leave with a final example and use another experiment if people want to do this, is TV news, which is, of course, just abysmal in every possible way. If you look at the length of time that any given news show or news segment will be on, usually it's under a minute. I mean, well under a minute. If something is treated on an evening news program for 3 minutes, that will be like the end of the universe. We'll get 3 minutes. And so whatever else happens, and whatever else, how good it is or whatever, what happens is you get some visuals and you get some words about a subject for 3 minutes, maybe, or a minute. And then you get another subject. And it produces if you were bothering to watch the news, which I hope you aren't, it produces a sense that the world is a kind of place that can be comprehended in 1 minute segments or 2 minute segments or a 30-second quick flyover or a 4-minute conversation. And you go, hey, maybe, just maybe, the world is more subtle than that. There's more complexity. There's more historical background that needs to be covered. There's, it's just more subtle and complicated and difficult and fun and interesting and challenging than you can possibly cover in 2 minutes, regardless of what you say about the subject. It's not the content of it. It's just the fact that a 1 or 2 minute segment cannot communicate very much about the world to you, particularly in the sense of news. And there's a lot of studies that are done that are fascinating, that the more news you watch, which tends also, by the way, be associated with higher education, the more wrong you get about the world, right? You generally tend to do less well when asked certain kinds of questions about the world, because it actively misinforms, not on purpose, but it's just the sense that you get of how the world is so radically different and so hopeless when you're trying to do it in 30-second or 1 minute or 2 minute segments, that it just actually causes you to be less perceptive of the world than if you didn't have any access to it at all, which was sort of interesting and fascinating, at least to me. So when you add this all up, what you have is a medium that Americans are watching 28 hours-ish a week, 20 to 30, varies with your age, and a lot of people are doing it on their phones, etc. But that has all these incredible constraints on it, both in its form, in the way it affects us physiologically, in the way it's actually made structurally with jump cuts and shaky cams and all of this, and in the way that actual advertising creates the world that is possible for us to view, because it funds it and it makes it possible, and therefore it shapes it quite powerfully. And so even given all the limitations of the medium, it's not being used very experimentally or aggressively or as interestingly as it could be because of these outside forces. But again, because that's so many people's window onto the world, 80% of your free time, the values there, the images, the way the world is presented, it doesn't matter. Even if you sit there 28 hours a week saying no, 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 it's too late, right? That's too much. You're just being inculcated as just this endless flow, 20,000 commercials. There's a great point in Dostoevsky's biography where he was in prison, and he was a modernist, progressive atheist for his time, and they have his only book they would give him was a Bible, and so he kept writing. And in the margins he wrote yet, no, 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 and then finally he cracked, and the experience of being in prison, of being just the whole environment of finding he was being put to death, and he became this really, really fundamental Orthodox Russian Christian of the most profound kind. I mean, I think absolutely most profound kind. But in that environment, if the only thing he had access to, you can only say no so long, niet, but it doesn't matter. You're still getting it. You're still imbibing it. And so I think, as an experiment, try the Zen and the Art of TV watching. Just sit for 5 minutes. Try the jump cut. See that. And see if you can count those for a little bit, and then just ponder, not what am I seeing, but what can't be shown. What would I really like to watch? What do I enjoy doing that isn't really come across at all on the screen? And when you ask these kinds of questions, and then start asking, well, why is this on this? Why is this being presented as opposed to anything else? I think you can see the pervasive and incredibly powerful impact that this strange medium has on the collective imagination for the vast majority of citizens in the United States and around the world anymore. So, TV, the belly of the beast. Thank you very much.